The Cosmic Horror Index had existed since before the first stars learned how to burn. It was not a book. It was not a computer or a database or anything that could fit inside a normal mind. The index was alive in its own strange way. It watched and recorded and remembered everything about how thinking creatures reacted when they met things they could not understand. For billions of years, the index had seen the same thing happen again and again. A species would grow smart enough to leave their home world. They would build ships and explore the dark places between the stars. And then they would find something that did not belong in their universe. Something that moved in ways that broke the laws of physics. Something that existed in directions that brains were never built to see. The results were always the same: madness, death. Sometimes every member of a species would simply stop moving, their minds broken beyond repair. Sometimes they would tear themselves apart. Sometimes they would change into things that were no longer what they used to be. In 4 billion years, the index had never recorded a single species that could look at true cosmic horror and remain whole. So when the humans came, the index expected nothing different. The ship was called the Perseverance. It was small by galactic standards, carrying only 12 crew members through the empty space between stars. Captain sat in her command chair, watching the readings on her screen with growing concern. Something was wrong with space itself. The numbers made no sense. The instruments showed things that should not be possible. "Captain," said her first officer, his voice shaking, "the forward sensors are detecting. I don't know how to describe it. It's like space is folding, but not in any way our physics can explain." Leaned forward. Through the viewing window she could see it now, a shape that was not really a shape. It existed in more dimensions than the human eye could process, and her brain struggled to make sense of what she was seeing. It was dark and light at the same time. It was huge and small. It was there and not there. Around her, crew members began to scream. The ship's doctor fell to his knees, covering his eyes with both hands. The navigator simply stared, her mouth open, tears running down her face. The ship's artificial intelligence began outputting random noise, its programming unable to handle what its sensors were recording. The Cosmic Horror Index watched with its ancient attention. It had seen this moment countless times before. Now would come the breaking. Now would come the madness. But did something the index had never seen before. She laughed. It was not the laughter of someone who had lost their mind. It was sharp and strong and full of something that might have been recognition. She stood up from her chair, her legs steady, her eyes fixed on the impossible thing outside her ship. "I know you," she said quietly. "I've seen things like you before, in my nightmares. In the stories my grandmother told me to scare me when I was little. In the books I read under my blankets with a flashlight when I was supposed to be sleeping." She stepped closer to the window. Her heart was beating fast. Her hands were trembling. She was terrified, more afraid than she had ever been in her life. But she did not break. "You think this is scary," she whispered to the thing that should not exist. "I grew up in the flood zones of. I buried my mother when I was 15. I fought my way through the academy when everyone told me I didn't belong there. I've been afraid my whole life. Fear is the only thing I've never been afraid of." The index paused in its documentation. This was new. This was unprecedented. Turned back to her crew. 3 of them were still screaming. 5 had collapsed, but 4 others were beginning to stand up again, their faces pale but their eyes clearing. "Listen to me," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "I know what you're feeling. I know it feels like your mind is being torn apart, but you've felt this before. Remember the first time you watched a horror movie that really got to you. Remember the nightmares you had as a child. This is the same thing. It's just bigger." Her first officer looked up at her. "Captain, I can't. My brain can't." "Yes, it can," said firmly. "It doesn't have to understand, it just has to keep working. That's what human brains do. We see things we can't explain and we give them names. We call them monsters. We call them gods. We call them nightmares. and then we keep going. Slowly, impossibly, her crew began to recover. Not all of them. Two would never be the same, their minds too damaged to repair. One died, his heart simply stopping from the shock, but 9 of them stood up. 9 of them looked at the impossible thing outside their ship and chose to keep functioning. The Index watched this with what might have been confusion. It began to review its records, searching for any similar case in its 4 billion years of observation. It found nothing. Turned back to the window. The entity was still there, still impossible, still breaking every rule of physics and logic, but somehow it seemed smaller now, not because it had changed, but because she had decided she could contain it in her mind, not understand it, just hold it. Take us back to normal space, she ordered, and mark these coordinates. We'll need to study this. We'll need to learn how to help others survive it. Captain, her navigator said, her voice hoarse but steady, how did you do that? How did you not break? Was quiet for a long moment. When I was a child, she finally said, my grandmother would tell me stories about the old gods, the ones who came from the sea and the darkness. She told me these stories not to make me safe, but to make me ready. She said that fear was like a muscle. If you never use it, it stays weak. But if you exercise it, if you face small fears and learn to survive them, then when the big fear comes, you have the strength to carry it. She looked at her crew, these brave people who had just survived something that had destroyed thousands of other species. Humans have been exercising that muscle for 100,000 years, she said. Every monster story around a campfire, every nightmare we woke up from and chose to go back to sleep, every horror movie we watched through our fingers, we've been training for this moment our entire existence as a species. The Index created a new entry in its eternal records. It had to. Nothing in its existing categories could contain what it had just witnessed. Species name, Homo. Earth Sol System. Response to cosmic horror, unprecedented. Notes, first recorded species to demonstrate fear-based survival mechanism. Further observation required. The Index settled in to watch. For the first time in 4 billion years, it was genuinely curious to see what would happen next. Part 2. 17 years had passed since the Perseverance made first contact with the outer dark. In that time, humanity had done something that shocked every other species in the galaxy. They had gone back. The Galactic Concord was an alliance of 340 different species. They had existed for millions of years, building civilizations and sharing technology, and carefully mapping the regions of space that must never be entered. The outer dark, they called it. The places where things lived that could shatter minds just by being seen. Every species in the Concord had learned this lesson through tragedy. They had lost 2 colony worlds to madness plagues. The Empire had sent a fleet of 10,000 ships into the Screaming Nebula and received back only a single vessel, crewed by things that wore bodies like costumes. The Ancient had mapped 300 dangerous zones before they finally accepted that some places were simply forbidden. And then the humans arrived. Ambassador of the stood before the Concord Assembly, his 4 arms trembling with emotion. The great chamber was filled with representatives from hundreds of worlds, all of them watching the holographic display in the center of the room. They have established research stations, announced. His translator device struggled to convey his disbelief. In the Screaming Nebula, the same place where the lost their fleet, the humans are living there, working there, taking samples. The display showed footage from the human station. Scientists in protective suits were walking among impossible plants that grew in patterns no brain should be able to process. One researcher, a young woman with dark hair, was smiling as she documented a creature that appeared to be made of crystallized terror. "This is insanity," said the representative, his voice harsh. "They will be consumed. They will become vessels just as our people did." "That is what we assumed," replied. "We have been assuming it for 17 years, and yet they continue to survive." The eldest member of the Concord spoke next. It was a being so old that it communicated only through gravity waves, ripples in spacetime that the other species translators had to interpret. How? It asked. We have studied human biology. Their neural architecture is no more robust than ours. Their minds should shatter just as easily. The answer came from the human representative, Dr. James. He was a soft-spoken man from Lagos, who had personally survived 3 expeditions into the outer dark. He stood calmly in the center of the assembly, surrounded by beings who looked at humans with a mixture of fear and fascination. "You misunderstand fear," he said gently. "For your species, fear evolved as a warning system. It tells you to run, to hide, to avoid, to forget. This works well against predators and natural dangers, but it becomes a weakness when the threat cannot be outrun or forgotten." He paused, choosing his words carefully. Humanity evolved differently. We developed something we call horror as a cultural adaptation. We tell each other stories of terrifying things, monsters that live in the dark, ghosts of the dead, creatures that cannot be killed, gods that care nothing for mortal lives. "Why would you do this?" asked a representative from a species that had no concept of fiction. "Why deliberately frighten yourselves?" "To prepare," James replied. "We did not know it at the time, of course. We thought we were simply entertaining ourselves. But every horror story, every nightmare tale, every monster movie we watched through our fingers was training. We were teaching our minds how to encounter the impossible and keep functioning." He pulled up a display showing humanity's cultural history. Thousands of years of horror fiction, from ancient myths about underworld journeys to modern psychological thrillers. A human child who survives their first encounter with the outer dark has, in a very real sense, already survived it 1,000 times, James continued. They have seen impossible things in their imagination. They have felt terror in the safety of their beds. They have practiced being afraid and then choosing to continue anyway. The chamber was silent. The concept was almost too strange to process. "But how does this help?" asked. "Understanding that something will hurt you does not stop it from hurting you." "No," James agreed. "But understanding that you can survive the hurt, that you can carry the wound and keep moving, that makes all the difference. Your species experiences fear as a binary state. Either you are safe or you are in danger. Either you can handle a threat or you cannot. But humans have learned to exist in a third state. We can be terrified, completely overwhelmed by something we cannot understand and still choose to function." He smiled slightly. "We have a saying on Earth, feel the fear and do it anyway. It sounds simple, but it is actually a profound psychological adaptation. We have taught ourselves that fear and action are not opposites. You can be afraid and brave at the same time." The Cosmic Horror Index was monitoring this conversation through means the conquered could not detect. It had been watching humanity for 17 years now, revising and updating its records constantly. What James was describing matched what the index had observed. Humans did not resist the outer dark. They did not fight it or deny it. They simply accommodated it. They made room in their minds for things that should not fit. They felt their sanity strain and crack, and then they patched the cracks with something stronger than sanity. The index began updating its classification system. A new category was needed. Species category, horror adapted unique. "What are you doing with this knowledge?" the ancient being asked. "Why are you building stations in the outer dark?" "We are learning," James said. "The entities that live in those places have existed for billions of years. They have knowledge we cannot even imagine, and they have noticed us now. They know that we are different from other species. Some of them are curious about us." "Curious?" The word rippled through the chamber with disbelief. "The outer dark is not curious. It does not think, it simply destroys." "That was true before," James replied, "because no species ever survived long enough to be interesting. But we are still here. We are still watching. And some of them, the older ones, the more aware ones, are starting to watch us back." He turned to face the full assembly. "We are not just surviving the outer dark," he said. "We are building a relationship with it. We are becoming the first species in the history of the galaxy to look into the abyss and make the abyss blink first." The Index recorded this statement carefully. It was beginning to understand something important about humans. They did not just tolerate fear, they used it. Fear was not their enemy. It was their tool. And with that tool, they were doing things that should not be possible. Part 3. The entity that humanity would later call the Shepherd of Empty Stars had consumed 11,000 civilizations across 3 galaxies. It was not evil. Evil requires intent, and the Shepherd had no more intent than a hurricane or a wildfire. It simply existed, and the existence of thinking minds near it was like flame existing near paper. Eventually, inevitably, the paper burned. When the Shepherd turned its attention toward the Milky Way, the galactic conquered received the news with despair. They had known this day would come eventually. The outer dark was always expanding, always hungry, and now the most terrible entity they had ever recorded was coming for them. The Cosmic Horror Index prepared to document the end of the galaxy's remaining civilizations. It would be a quick process, historically speaking. A few thousand years at most. The Shepherd would drift through the Milky Way, and every sentient species in its path would simply stop being sentient. Their minds would unravel, absorbed into the Shepherd's infinite dreaming. But the humans had other plans. The fleet that intercepted the Shepherd was small by galactic standards. Just 12 ships, each crewed by 50 volunteers. They had been training for this moment for decades, ever since humanity's observers in the outer dark first noticed the Shepherd moving in their direction. Admiral stood on the bridge of the Defiance, watching the Shepherd approach. It was not like other entities from the outer dark. It was older, more complete. Where other cosmic horrors were fragments of impossible geometry, the Shepherd was a whole thing, a complete existence that just happened to be incompatible with the existence of organized thought. Around her, her crew was afraid. Their hands shook on their controls. Some wept silently, tears running down their faces as their minds struggled to process what they were seeing. One young ensign was reciting poetry under her breath, something about refusing to go gently into that good night. But none of them broke. They had been chosen from millions of volunteers, selected not for their bravery, but for their relationship with fear. Each of them had spent years in specialized training programs. They had meditated in the traditions of a dozen Earth cultures. They had been exposed, gradually and carefully, to increasing levels of cosmic horror. They had watched the most disturbing movies ever made, read the most terrifying books, experienced virtual simulations designed to push their minds to the breaking point. And they had learned something that no other species had ever learned. Fear was not the enemy, fear was the teacher. "All ships," Admiral said calmly, "begin the witness protocol." The Cosmic Horror Index did not know what the witness protocol was. It had observed humans for decades now, but they had kept this secret carefully hidden. Now it watched with ancient curiosity as something unprecedented began to unfold. The human ships did not attack the Shepherd. They had no weapons that could harm something like this. Fighting it would be like trying to punch the concept of infinity. Instead, they spread out in a careful pattern, positioning themselves around the Shepherd like points on a geometric shape. And then they looked at it. That was all. 600 humans turned their attention to the Shepherd of Empty Stars and simply looked. They felt the terror that came from seeing it. They felt their sanity strain under the weight of its impossible existence. They felt the urge to look away, to flee, to surrender their minds to the comfortable darkness of unconsciousness. And they accepted these feelings. They did not fight them. They did not deny them. They simply held them the way you might hold a heavy weight, acknowledging the pain but choosing not to drop it. Admiral spoke softly, her words broadcast to all 12 ships. "We see you. We are afraid of you. We accept our fear. We accept that we cannot understand you. We accept that we may die here. We accept all of this and we choose to remain." The shepherd paused. In 11,000 civilizations, nothing like this had ever happened before. Minds that perceived the shepherd dissolved like sugar in water. But these minds were different. They were dissolving and reforming at the same time, constantly breaking and constantly rebuilding themselves. The humans were afraid, but they were not running. They did not understand the shepherd, but they were not trying to. They were simply witnessing, being present, holding space for something impossible and refusing to collapse under its weight. The index recorded something it had never recorded before. The shepherd was hesitating. It was not designed to hesitate. It was not designed to do anything but exist and consume. But something about these tiny creatures, these fragile beings who should have shattered the moment they saw it, was making it pause. "We are not your enemies," Admiral continued. "We are not even your opposite. We are just different. We are things that can see you and still exist. We are things that can be afraid of you and still remain whole. We do not know if you can understand us. We do not know if you can think at all, but we wanted you to know that we are here. We see you, and we are not going away." The shepherd did something that should not have been possible. It turned away. Not defeated, not frightened, something else. Something that might have been recognition if recognition was possible for a being like this. It had encountered something new, something that did not fit its ancient patterns, and it chose to move in a different direction. The index watched as the shepherd drifted back toward the spaces between galaxies, toward the empty places where it could exist without touching thinking minds. It was not destroyed. It would never be destroyed. But it was no longer coming for the Milky Way. Admiral sat down in her command chair, her whole body shaking. Tears were running down her face. She had never been more afraid in her life. But she was still here. Her crew was still here. They had looked at something that had consumed 11,000 civilizations, and they had survived. "All ships," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "stand down from witness protocol. Good work, everyone, we made it." 3 centuries later, the Cosmic Horror Index completed its final report on humanity. Species Homo. Earth Sol System. Classification unique. Notes: first documented species to achieve stable interaction with outer dark entities through cultural adaptation. Species developed practice of deliberate fear exposure through fictional narratives, resulting in unprecedented psychological resilience. Recommend reclassification of horror response as potential survival mechanism rather than terminal failure state. Additional observation: species appears to have developed cultural practice of deliberately seeking terrifying experiences for entertainment purposes. Index lacks sufficient data to fully model this behavior, but notes strong correlation with species resilience. Further study recommended. Final assessment: fear does not destroy humanity. Humanity has learned to make fear their teacher, their tool, and their strength. The only species in galactic history to look into the abyss and emerge stronger for having done so. Status: monitoring ongoing. Recommend caution. This species demonstrates adaptation capabilities that exceed all previous models. Somewhere on Earth, far from the cosmic wonders and horrors of deep space, a child sat in a dark room. She was 8 years old, hiding under her blankets with a flashlight, reading a book about monsters. Her heart was beating fast. The story was scary, maybe too scary for someone her age. But she kept reading. She turned the page to see what would happen next, even though she was afraid, especially because she was afraid. Without knowing it, she was training herself, preparing for challenges she could not imagine, building strength she would not need for decades. The Cosmic Horror Index watched her from across the vast distances of space and time. It watched millions of human children just like her, all of them practicing fear in the safety of their beds. And for the first time in its ancient existence, the index understood something important. Horror was not humanity's weakness. Horror was their training ground. Every scary story, every nightmare, every monster under the bed was a lesson in survival. The humans had spent 100,000 years preparing for the darkness between the stars. And when they finally met that darkness, they were ready. The child finished her book and clicked off her flashlight. She lay in the darkness for a moment, her heart still racing, her mind full of monsters. Then she smiled, pulled her blankets up to her chin, and went to sleep. She would dream of the monsters tonight. She always did after reading books like that. But she was not afraid of her dreams. She was practicing. The end.